You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast. My guest is Michael Martin. He's the founder of RapidSOS. The website is rapidsos.com. So, Michael, thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be on.
Yeah, so tell me about RapidSOS. What's the premise of the company?
Yeah, so RapidSOS is an advanced emergency technology company. So we've spent the last 6 years working with thousands of 911 telecommunicators and first responders across the United States to figure out basically how we can provide more life-saving data and content into those systems during an emergency. So most of us often aren't really aware of how these systems work, but there's over 6,000 different 911 centers across the United States, and they're running over 25,000 different software systems. So the result is that when you have an emergency in this country, you're often hitting actually technology that dates all the way back to the 1960s and is basically just analog voice. So we provide rich data in there from partners like Apple and Google and Uber and other major technology companies.
Yeah, I could see, like, even in the interest of national security, it would be a treasure trove of information if it was all linked and if it was savable and if you could, look at the database of what's happening and where and index it. And I would think that, I don't know if it's allowed to, but I would think that the government would be very interested in modernizing it again and looking at that data.
Yeah, I don't think it's, it's actually not nearly as sophisticated as that. It's not some sort of national window into the health of the U.S. emergency system. It actually comes down to really basic stuff that would I think blow most of our minds if you knew it actually didn't exist previously. So, for example, when you call 911 today, most calls cannot be located. Or they come in on a delay, I should say. So the result is that the FCC estimated in 2014 that there were over 10,000 lives a year that could be saved if we could just more accurately locate people in an emergency. So this is actually really fundamental stuff that in the middle of a heart attack, assault, kidnapping, if you can't verbally articulate your name, address, and what is occurring, it's often very difficult to find you or send help. So working on things like that, working on connecting a variety of real-time sensor data directly to first responders. So I always think about, for example, the Oakland fire, which occurred about 2 years ago in December 2016. And if you saw the interview of the two survivors, they actually ran out of that building, called 911, unfortunately got routed to not the local 911 center, and they had a very hard time transferring the call because the two survivors didn't know their location. So it wasn't until actually they were able to, so they actually ended up running up the street to the fire department and getting help that way. Now in 2016, right, particularly as we continue to move forward, the building should call 911. And first responders should know that the smoke density is X and the temperature is Y, and that in this case, there was 36 people that were trapped in the northwest corner that ended up dying in that incident, one of the deadliest fires in U.S. history. So we work to kind of take all that data and put it directly into the hands of 911 first responders in an emergency.
Yeah, I would think even if it's not going to be taken nationally, at least on a local level, 911 essentially is an extension of policing. It's an extension of fire. It's an extension of a lot of things. So all those departments really need each other's data and need to work together to be more effective.
911 telecommunicators, these really are the first responders. You can think of it that way, right? So every day across the United States, we have 650,000 911 calls that are made, and these are the worst moments of someone's life, right? And these heroes on the front lines of those emergencies, they're managing those calls every moment of every day. And prior to us, they were doing that. It was just a copper wire voice conversation. So I'll never forget, Richard, my very first 911 call that I had the chance to listen in on. It was in rural Massachusetts, and it was a mother who called after her son had committed suicide. He hung himself in their closet. And she was just hysterical, right, as she called. And I lasted about 15 seconds on that call. I took off my headset and I actually walked outside. But that 911 telecommunicator didn't have that luxury. She had to stay on the phone for the next 15 minutes, figure out the location, and continue speaking to that mother until the ambulance arrived. And then she had to do that for the rest of her 12-hour shift. So it's hard to verbally articulate just how intense it is to have this job and how tremendously more difficult and frustrating it is when you have one of those callers that's in one of those circumstances and you can't even locate them. One other quick example, many of us may have seen a few years ago the national television awareness commercial on a domestic violence abuse case where the woman called 911 and pretended to order a pizza. So her husband was being abusive in that moment, and obviously 911 didn't get the location. So luckily she was smart enough to pretend she was ordering a pizza and actually gave her address that way. So it really is just extraordinary the work that 911 is doing every day.
Well, I mean, cell phones, smartphones seem to have special features where you can make a 911 call even if your service isn't activated. So why is there still a disconnect? I mean, like, who is the one that allocates funding for 911 in different areas, and who are you interacting with to try to improve the technology?
Yeah, it's a very complicated system, but I think you're absolutely correct, Richard, that like the voice component of 911 works extraordinarily well. I mean, it is, so when you dial 911, you're given priority on the network, and you're very quickly going to reach the nearest 911 center. The challenge is that system dates back, as I mentioned, to the 1960s and 1970s, and the infrastructure behind it. And the result is that it can't accommodate data. It's actually limited to only 512 bytes of data. I'll just kind of put that in perspective. The very first transatlantic telegram between the Queen of England to President Buchanan in 1858 had 617 bytes of data. So here we are 160 years later, and when you call 911, they typically don't even get your name. So it is remarkably how antiquated this infrastructure is. So it is funded typically at a local and state level. There's basically very little national oversight of our 911 system. And it really developed, as I mentioned, in the 1960s and 1970s with over 10,000 municipalities looking at how they could put in their own system. And so that was some of the challenges that we needed to work through was how do we interface into this very fragmented 911 system that we have in the U.S.
Yeah, that's crazy. You said the technology is very antiquated. So, the whole premise of your company is to improve this. So what's the mechanisms by which you're doing it? What are you up to?
Yeah. So what we found as we went and we studied this. So we actually found it out of grad school. My co-founder was at MIT at the time doing his PhD, and I was at Harvard doing a master's program. So that summer, I borrowed my dad's Prius and actually drove about 1,500 miles that summer, and amazingly had thousands of 911 officials who were willing to meet with me. So the deeper we went into this industry, what we realized was the challenge was not necessarily the software systems that were running at the 911 centers. It was just the lack of content that was able to feed into them over this antiquated, often still analog voice infrastructure. So what we've worked on over the last 6 years is how do we upgrade those systems into this rich data framework? So you can almost, it wouldn't be a accurate statement, but it's a little bit of analogous. You can say where we're moving from a copper wire into those 911 centers into a rich fiber optic pipe, if you will, where we can fit a lot more content. And obviously, when you switch the paradigm from voice to data, you really need to do that well. So that's where we've spent about 4 years in various types of focus groups with hundreds of 911 centers to figure out if you're moving into a world where, for example, you might have real-time heart rate or blood pressure or vehicle telematics data, how do you actually make that useful to an emergency response rather than just having an information overload sort of scenario? So we've worked with these 911 centers. We have over 50 public safety software companies that are partners of ours to develop the interfaces so that 911 telecommunicators and increasingly actually all the way out into the ambulance and the first responder network, they can actually receive this data and it's to present it to the right place at the right time in the response. So the impact we're typically seeing in the range of between 30 seconds and over 7 minutes faster response in an emergency, which can be pretty profound for many types of emergencies.
So, all right. So you've been speaking to a lot of 911 companies or organizations. So what's the rollout plan? What is it going to look like? Where and when? And what are you going to be doing?
Yeah, so today we're managing about 60% of U.S. 911 traffic, providing life-saving data for it. So we are live in about over 2,200 different public safety agencies. These are many of the largest ones in the United States. So cities like Los Angeles, Denver, Seattle, Portland, Chicago, et cetera. And then that content is, as I mentioned, we power over 250 million Americans, whether it's various smartphone connected devices or connected vehicles, connected home, digital health devices, et cetera. So we merge all this content together around an emergency, and then we present it in a way that is useful to drive a faster, more effective response.
Okay, I mean, can you clarify a little bit on content and what that means to help the response rate and the response efficacy?
Yeah, so it's it's location primarily, but it could also be we have 12.5 million people that have added their health profile into our databases. We power a number of connected car platforms. So let's just maybe spend a minute on that as an example. So if your vehicle's in a crash, previously, as you come up in that days, you would need to find your phone wherever it was in your car, dial the number, and then obviously the challenge there is not even just knowing your location. You're somewhere on the highway, right? But knowing that exact location is very difficult, typically. So now what occurs is the vehicle itself actually transmits the core data directly to 911 and first responders. So the location of the crash severity, potentially that there's 3 people in the vehicle, things like that.
Okay, all right, that's good. So what is the rollout of this going to look like? Is it definitely going to happen, or are you working on it, or what's the plan for you?
Yeah, as I mentioned, so we're now we provide this data to about 65% of U.S. Our 911 centers covering about 65% of the U.S. population, and we power about 250 million connected devices today. So starting with just really basic stuff like providing location on a smartphone 911 call, to a variety of services where people use various vehicle crash response services or senior care services like a help by phone and can't get up type of service, or a home security service. We increasingly power a lot of those different systems.
Okay. All right. So again, over the next 6 months or a year, what do you think is going to be the trajectory of the growth or the rollout of this?
Yeah. So there's basically 2 major initiatives for us over this next year. So this past year, we went from about 10,000 connected devices to over 250 million, raised $46 million for the company, and grew the team about 140%. So we largely now, as I mentioned, are managing most U.S. 911 traffic. And so for 2019, obviously, it's making sure that every 911 system in the U.S. has access to this technology, and we do provide it for free to public safety. So we're just going to be reaching that final 35% of the country that doesn't yet have access. And then we are starting our international expansion. So we're currently live in 1 other country, and we have about a dozen or so other countries that are waiting on access. So global emergency communication largely follows the U.S. model, which means in most parts of the world, when you have an emergency, you need to dial a phone number and have a coherent conversation in the middle of that emergency. So we're working to shift that paradigm from voice to life-saving data on a global scale.
And the data itself, what do you think is what happens to it now? Is it just logged somewhere, or where does it go? And what do you think is going to happen with the data? What should happen with it in the future? Yeah,
so we're not a data company, and we don't retain data. So we just transfer it to the appropriate 911 or first responder agency that's managing that emergency. And we only do it actually where we have coverage. So, for example, if you dial 911 in a part of the country where we don't yet have the system live, then actually that data actually never comes into us. So the way it works is if you're in an agency where we are live, we've actually geofenced all those agencies for our partners. So if you're on a smartphone and you call 911 and you're in an agency that we are live in, the location data passes through our infrastructure into that local 911 system. And then the 911 system obviously is using that data as appropriate for that emergency. So if your location, they're certainly going to use that to send a police or fire or ambulance to you, depending on the type of help you need. In those cases, the agency might store that data, but obviously we're just the pipes to get it there.
Is there any initiative to make the smartphone perhaps the core of the interaction with the 911 system, or do a lot of people still call in from landlines? Like when the calls come in, where do they tend to come from? Is there any intelligence on that?
Yeah, it is. Most U.S. 911 calls do come from smartphones today. The growth of wireless has been obviously significant. And so today you have about 240 million 911 calls nationally. Approximately 80 to 85% of those are coming from cell phones. And obviously the vast majority of those calls today are from smartphones. So this actually created more challenges for 911. It's kind of ironic. We think that as we move forward in technology, 911 would naturally get better. But actually what was occurring is when we switched from landline calls that had a fixed billing address that 911 was able to receive to a mobile call, that actually created this location challenge. So the way the legacy 911 system used to work is you would call 911 and then the phone number was affiliated with a billing address, and 911 would receive that and they knew exactly where to send help. So as we entered the mobile era back in the 1980s, you started seeing that they just couldn't locate these calls, and that's unfortunately largely persisted to forward into 2018 and 2019. So that's an example where we're now starting to leverage the capabilities of the smartphone to pass all this data. Another example here would be our work with Uber, where for passengers that need help on a ride, so for example, you get if someone's having a heart attack in the back of an Uber or something like that, there's now an ability to call 911 through the Uber app, and we actually transmit a variety of additional information about the ride, such as the make, model, color of the vehicle, the license plate number, and obviously the location as well.
Would the goal be then to embed a 911 type app in the smartphone itself, or some kind of functionality that would let people, again, call 911, besides dialing on the phone, I don't know, some other way? Maybe they could speak into it, or someone else could speak. I don't know. I mean, I guess there'd be various mechanisms and capture all the data that you need.
Yeah, so you may have actually seen, most of the leading smartphone manufacturers have actually built in some of this functionality today. So whether it's hitting the side button on an Apple phone 5 times or Samsung device, there's or the emergency SOS functionality on some of the smart watches, you are seeing a variety of ways in which users can better interact from a UX standpoint with 911 to at least initiate an emergency. Obviously, that's just scratching the surface on what you can do in a data world, particularly around major disaster scenarios. So, for example, during Hurricane Harvey, you had such a large influx of 911 traffic that at peak moments, you had up to a 45-minute wait time to get through. And the 911 telecommunicators in Greater Harris County and in the Houston area were doing just extraordinary work, working night and day to staff at peak levels for that. But there was just so much demand to be rescued during that scenario. So you can imagine where a data-driven approach could really be helpful there, where people could mark that, hey, they needed water rescue. And we could actually coordinate all that geospatially. And so now when, say, a rescue boat arrives at an apartment complex, they know exactly that there's 12 people located in that building, and they know the precise location of those 12. So there's certainly all sorts of ways that this can head longer term. But obviously today we're just trying to do really fundamental things like transmit baseline location information, and to the extent that users have opted into some sort of service, relevant health and medical data, vehicle telematics, et cetera.
All right, well, very good. So what's the best way for interested parties to get in contact, ask questions, and maybe collaborate on various projects?
Yeah, so this is, I would say, in general, there's two different groups that we often work with. So certainly any sort of connected device company that wants to pass that data directly to 911 during an emergency. So we do have a API that you can access on our website, RapidSOS.com. It's somewhat similar to like a Twilio setup or something like that. And then obviously for any first responder agency, you can access this technology for free. And that's also through our website, RapidSOS.com. In general, anyone can get a hold of us at info@RapidSOS.com. And then we're based in New York City. So.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, I appreciate you coming on the podcast, and the service is definitely needed. So it's a good thing that you're doing.
Thank you for having me, Richard, and it's really great to spend a few minutes with you.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.